Picture this. You're standing in the torchlit depths of an Egyptian tomb in 1450 BC, watching as priests prepare the body of Pharaoh Amenhotep II for his journey to the afterlife. The air is thick with myrrh and natron salt, and the walls echo with chanted prayers that have been recited for thousands of years. But there's something else in this sacred chamber, something that fills you with unease despite the desert heat. Because arranged around the pharaoh's golden sarcophagus are 6 other bodies. Young women dressed in their finest linens, their faces painted with kohl and rouge as if they're merely sleeping. Except they're not sleeping. They've been killed with silk cords, their lives extinguished at the peak of their youth and beauty to serve their king in death as they served him in life. You watch as the priests position these women carefully around their master, a musician with her harp still clutched in her dead fingers, a dancer whose anklets still bear tiny bells that will never sound again, a concubine adorned with jewels that symbolized her place in the royal court. Each one selected not for their willingness to die, but for their usefulness to a dead man's eternal comfort. And as the tomb doors are sealed with molten lead and sacred spells, you realize you're witnessing not a burial, but a mass killing sanctioned by divine decree, celebrated by an entire civilization that sees nothing wrong with turning living women into grave goods. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was standard practice across dozens of ancient civilizations. The deliberate killing of servants, wives, and slaves to accompany their masters into death. And the methods used, the selection process, the final moments of these victims represent some of the most calculated cruelty in human history. The practice has a name that sounds almost clinical in its detachment: human sacrifice burial. Archaeologists use terms like retainer sacrifice and subsidiary burial to describe what was essentially ritualized murder on a massive scale. But these academic terms sanitize the reality of what happened in those tombs and burial pits. They obscure the terror of young women dragged from their beds knowing they would never see another sunrise. The desperation of servants who tried to flee when they learned their master was dying. The systematic preparation of human beings for execution like livestock being fattened for market. Let's begin in ancient Ur, around 2500 BC, where the Sumerians perfected the art of royal burial sacrifice. When Queen Puabi died, her funeral became a spectacle of orchestrated death that would make even hardened warriors sick. Archaeologists uncovered her tomb in the 1920s, and what they found still disturbs researchers today. 73 bodies arranged in neat rows around the queen's burial chamber. Not scattered or thrown in, carefully positioned as if they'd simply laid down and gone to sleep. But the evidence tells a different story. Analysis of the remains shows that most were young women between 18 and 25. They wore elaborate headdresses of gold leaves and carnelian beads. Their bodies were adorned with necklaces, earrings, and rings that would have taken months to craft. They'd been dressed for death like brides for a wedding. Except their wedding was to the grave. The killing method was particularly cruel. Most showed signs of mercury poisoning, suggesting they were forced to drink a cocktail of mercury and other toxins that would have caused excruciating death. Mercury poisoning was likely used, which could have caused great suffering before death. These women spent their last hours dressed in their finest clothes, surrounded by others facing the same tragic fate. You were probably selected years in advance if you served in a royal household in ancient Ur. The moment you entered palace service, your fate was potentially sealed. Every day you dressed the queen, brought her food, played music for her entertainment. You were really preparing for your own execution. Some historians argue these servants went willingly, believing they'd enjoy eternal privilege serving their mistress in the afterlife. But the positioning of the bodies tells a different story. Several skeletons show defensive wounds, broken fingers from trying to pry open sealed doors, scratch marks on the tomb walls where fingernails broke off in desperate attempts to escape. One young woman, probably around 20 years old, was found with her hands clutched around her throat. Not in a position of peaceful repose, but as if caught in a moment of struggle. Another had crawled several feet from her assigned position before dying, leaving a trail of disturbed dust that remained undisturbed for 4,500 years. These weren't willing participants in a religious ceremony. They were victims of a system that valued their lives less than the comfort of a corpse. Moving forward in time to ancient China's Shang dynasty, around 1200 BC, we find an even more elaborate system of burial sacrifice. When King Wu Ding died, his funeral became a massacre that claimed over 200 lives. But what makes the Shang sacrifices particularly horrifying is the methodical nature of the selection and killing process. It wasn't random or chaotic. It was bureaucratically organized murder. The Shang kept detailed records on oracle bones, and these records described the selection process with chilling precision. Young women were chosen based on specific criteria. Physical beauty was paramount. They had to be between 15 and 20 years old. Virgins were preferred. Their purity considered essential for serving the king in the afterlife. They underwent months of preparation, learning special dances and songs they would perform for their dead master for eternity. Imagine being one of these girls. You're 16 years old, selected from your village because of your beauty. You're told it's an honor, that your family will be compensated, that you'll live in luxury until the king needs you. But you know what needs you means. You've heard the screams from previous royal funerals. You've seen other girls disappear when nobles die, never to return. You're not being prepared for service. You're being prepared for slaughter. The killing methods varied based on the victim's status. Concubines and higher-ranking servants might receive the mercy of asphyxiation or poison. But lower-ranking victims faced more brutal ends. Some were entombed in a way that led to suffocation as the burial mound was completed, as the burial mound was constructed above them. Others were cast into pits after suffering fatal injuries, their bodies interred together in large numbers. Archaeological evidence from Tomb 1001 at Yinshu shows the remains of 34 young women, all killed within hours of each other. Their bodies show signs of different execution methods. Some had severe head injuries from blunt force, others had cut marks on their neck vertebrae. Several showed no obvious signs of violence, suggesting they were entombed while still alive or poisoned. The variety of killing methods suggests this wasn't a solemn religious ceremony but a frenzied massacre where the goal was simply to produce enough corpses to fill the tomb. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect was the treatment of pregnant victims. Several female skeletons found in Shang tombs were pregnant at the time of death. These women were carrying the king's children, potential heirs to the throne. But their pregnancy didn't save them. If anything, it guaranteed their death. The belief was that the king would want his unborn children with him in the afterlife, so even expectant mothers were not spared from this fate. One skeleton, designated M54 by archaeologists, was that of a woman in her third trimester. The positioning of the fetal remains suggests she was entombed while still alive. Their unborn children perished with them in the sealed tomb. Another pregnant woman showed defensive wounds on her arms, as if she'd tried to protect her unborn child. These weren't just murders. They were the systematic elimination of entire potential lineages. The Shang rulers justified this carnage through elaborate religious ideology. They believed the afterlife was essentially a continuation of earthly life, requiring the same servants, entertainers, and companions. But this wasn't really about religion. It was about power. The ability to command others to die for you, even after your own death, was the ultimate demonstration of authority. Every servant killed, every concubine strangled, every musician entombed while still alive reinforced the message that the king's power extended beyond death itself. Now, let me take you to ancient Egypt, where the practice of burial sacrifice reached levels of sophistication that make it even more disturbing. The Egyptians didn't just kill servants to accompany their pharaohs. They created an entire industry around preparing people for sacrificial death. Schools were established to train young women in the specific skills they'd need to serve their masters in the afterlife. Music, dance, cosmetics, sexual techniques, these weren't life skills, they were death skills. The selection process began in childhood. Girls as young as 6 or 7 were identified as potential burial companions based on their beauty, grace, and intelligence. They were removed from their families and raised in special quarters within the palace complex. They received the finest education available to women at the time. They learned to read and write hieroglyphics, to play complex musical instruments, to perform elaborate dances. They were taught the mythology of the afterlife in exhaustive detail, made to memorize the journey their master's soul would take and their role in ensuring his eternal comfort. But this education came with a terrible price. These girls grew up knowing their destiny was death. Every lesson in harp playing, every dance step mastered, every hieroglyphic learned brought them closer to their execution. They watched older girls disappear when nobles died, understanding that their turn would come. Some tried to escape, but where could they go? They'd been raised in isolation, taught skills useful only in palace service. Even if they managed to flee, they'd be hunted down and returned. The punishment for attempted escape was severe punishment before execution, a warning to others who might consider running. The psychological manipulation was masterful and cruel. These girls were told constantly that their sacrifice was the highest honor imaginable, that they were blessed above all other women to serve their divine Pharaoh in eternity. They were given privileges and luxuries that their families could never afford: fine clothes, jewelry, the best food. But every privilege was really a chain, binding them more tightly to their fate. They were being prepared for death like prized cattle, except cattle don't understand their destiny. When Pharaoh Jer died around 2900 BC, his funeral became one of the largest mass sacrifices in Egyptian history. 338 individuals were killed to accompany him, including 269 women. The tomb complex at Abydos reveals the systematic nature of the slaughter. The victims were arranged in neat rows around the royal burial chamber, each in their assigned position based on their role in serving the dead king. The method of execution was typically asphyxiation with a ceremonial cord. But this wasn't a quick death. Egyptian religious practice required that the victims remain pure, without visible wounds or blood. So they were gradually deprived of air until they lost consciousness. Some victims were given poison, likely opium mixed with hemlock, which caused paralysis before death. They would have been conscious yet immobilized as their breathing diminished. One particularly disturbing discovery was the burial of Pharaoh Semerket's court. Among the sacrificed were 6 young women found with their arms bound behind their backs and cloth gags still in their mouths. These weren't willing participants in a religious ceremony. They were captives, silenced to prevent their screams from disturbing the sacred funeral rites. The gags were made of fine linen, dyed blue, the color of divinity. Even their silence was ritualized, made sacred, transformed into part of the religious ceremony that justified their murder. The Egyptian practice included another horrifying element: child sacrifices. While not as common as adult sacrifices, children of servants were sometimes included, so families would remain together in the afterlife. The tomb of Queen Nephotep contained the remains of several children of servants were also placed in tombs, so families would remain together in the afterlife. These weren't random children, but the offspring of adult servants also buried in the tomb. Entire families exterminated to maintain the social structure of the royal household in death. But let's move to ancient Mesopotamia, where the Assyrians took burial sacrifice to new extremes of cruelty. When King Ashurbanipal died in 631 BC, his funeral included what chroniclers described as the gathering of flowers for the royal garden of eternity. This poetic phrase masked one of the most sadistic selection processes in history. Young women from conquered territories were brought to the capital specifically to be killed at the royal funeral. These weren't volunteers or even palace servants. They were prisoners of war, selected for their beauty from among captured populations. The Assyrians kept detailed records of these selections, written in cuneiform on clay tablets that survive today. One tablet describes the examination process. Let them be brought examined carefully by officials to ensure they met the strict standards for selection. Only the perfect flowers shall adorn the king's eternal garden. The sexual abuse implicit in these examinations was just the beginning of their ordeal. Once selected, these women were subjected to months of preparation that was essentially extreme psychological distress. They were taught Assyrian customs and language, forced to abandon their own cultural identity. They were made to participate in rituals honoring the king who had conquered their people, killed their families, destroyed their homes. They were required to compose and perform songs praising their captor, to dance in celebration of the empire that had enslaved them. The method of execution for Ashurbanipal's funeral victims was particularly grotesque. They were killed using a method called the eternal embrace. Each woman was positioned next to a statue of the king, then slowly crushed against it using a mechanical device that tightened leather straps around their bodies. The pressure was applied gradually over hours, first making breathing difficult, then causing immense pressure that eventually led to death. The goal was for them to die while literally embracing the king's image, their last breath expended against his stone likeness. Archaeological evidence from the royal tombs at Nimrud confirms these accounts. Skeletons show compression fractures consistent with gradual compression. Several victims showed signs of severe distress. Others show defensive wounds on their hands from trying to push away from the statues. One young woman, probably no more than 17, was found with her fingers still embedded in the clay of the statue's face, having clawed at it so desperately that her fingernails left permanent marks. The Assyrians documented these deaths with the same bureaucratic precision they applied to tax collection or military campaigns. Scribes recorded each victim's name, origin, age, and method of death. They noted how long each woman took to die, whether she screamed or remained silent, whether she struggled or accepted her fate. These records weren't hidden or considered shameful. They were part of the official royal archives, demonstrations of the king's power over life and death. But the horror didn't end with the king's burial. The Assyrians practiced a particularly cruel form of delayed sacrifice. Certain servants were selected to be buried not with the king, but after specific intervals. 7 days after the funeral, 7 more would be killed. After 40 days, 40 more. After 1 year, a final group would be sacrificed to mark the anniversary. These delayed victims lived in a special compound, knowing exactly when they would die, counting down the days to their execution. Imagine the extreme psychological distress of living in that compound. You wake each morning knowing you have 6 days left, then 5, then 4. You watch the sun rise and set, each sunset bringing you closer to death. You eat meals knowing how many more you'll have. You can't escape because you're under constant guard. You can't kill yourself because that would be sacrilege, and your family would be punished. You can only wait, watching others break down in terror, listening to them sob through the night until your appointed day arrives. The Vikings of Scandinavia, despite their distance from these Middle Eastern civilizations, developed their own brutal traditions of burial sacrifice. When a chieftain died, the practice of voluntary sacrifice was anything but voluntary. The historical account of Ibn Fadlan, an Arab chronicler who witnessed a Viking funeral in 922 AD, describes a scene of psychological manipulation and ultimate violence that shows how consent was manufactured. A young slave woman was asked who would join their master in death. The social pressure was immense. To refuse was to show disloyalty, to bring shame on yourself and potentially deadly consequences for other slaves. When one girl finally volunteered, she was immediately treated like royalty. For 10 days, she was given the finest clothes, the best food, unlimited alcohol. She was encouraged to drink constantly, keeping her in a state of intoxication that prevented clear thinking about what was coming. On the day of the funeral, the girl was subjected to ritual abuse and coercion by the chieftain's warriors, each claiming they were doing this out of love for their dead leader. Drugged, drunk, and traumatized, she was finally brought to the ship where the chieftain's body lay, where her life was ended in a ritual under the supervision of elders, with noise and ceremony concealing the act. The Japanese practice of junshi represented perhaps the most psychologically complex form of burial sacrifice. When a lord died, his retainers were expected to commit suicide to follow him in death. This wasn't technically murder, but rather enforced suicide, which in many ways was even crueler. The pressure to commit junshi was enormous. Those who refused were branded as cowards, their families disgraced, their names erased from records. Women faced particular pressure because their loyalty was measured not just by willingness to die but by the manner of their death. They were expected to dress in white funeral clothes, compose a death poem expressing their devotion, then inflict fatal wounds upon themselves with a ritual knife. But many couldn't go through with it, leading to scenes of forced assistance where other retainers would hold them down and guide the knife. The distinction between suicide and murder became meaningless. One account from 1657 describes the death of Lord Tadayoshi's concubines. 5 women were expected to follow him in death. 3 managed to kill themselves, but 2 younger ones, aged 16 and 19, became paralyzed with fear. They were helped by senior servants who held them in place while inflicting fatal wounds, all while maintaining the fiction that this was voluntary sacrifice. Their death poems, clearly written under duress, speak of joyfully following their lord, even as witnesses reported they had to be physically dragged to the death chamber. Now, let's examine what might be the most disturbing aspect of all these practices: the normalization of murder within highly sophisticated societies. These weren't primitive tribes acting on savage impulses. These were advanced civilizations with written laws, complex art, architectural marvels, and philosophical traditions. The same Egyptian culture that gave us mathematics and medicine also institutionalized mass murder. The same Chinese civilization that created poetry and porcelain also perfected bureaucratic genocide. The sophistication actually made it worse. These societies had the intellectual capacity to understand suffering, the organizational ability to prevent it, and the moral frameworks that could have condemned it. Instead, they chose to elaborate complex justifications for murder. They created entire theological systems explaining why some humans were destined from birth to be killed for others' comfort. They developed rituals and ceremonies that transformed murder into sacred duty. The preparation of sacrificial victims reveals the true sadism of these systems. It would have been simpler and arguably more merciful to kill servants immediately upon their master's death. Instead, victims often knew their fate months or even years in advance. They were forced to live with the knowledge of their coming execution, to continue serving the person whose death would trigger their own. Every meal they served, every song they sang, every dance they performed was counting down to their murder. This extreme psychological distress served a purpose beyond mere cruelty. It broke down resistance, created resigned acceptance, made victims complicit in their own deaths. By the time the execution day arrived, many victims were so psychologically destroyed that they appeared to go willingly to their deaths. This appearance of consent was crucial for maintaining the fiction that this was religious devotion rather than mass murder. The methods of execution reveal the sadistic creativity of these civilizations. Simple killing wasn't enough. The deaths had to be ritualized, prolonged, transformed into spectacle. Strangulation that took minutes instead of seconds, poisoning that caused hours of agony, being entombed in ways that led to suffocation over time, being crushed gradually against statues. Each method was designed not just to kill, but to create a specific type of death that fit the religious or cultural narrative. The sexual abuse that accompanied many of these sacrifices is often glossed over in historical accounts, but it was systematic and deliberate. Young women selected for sacrifice were often subjected to forced rituals and abuse before their deaths. This was justified as purification, or blessing, or marriage to the divine. But it was really about power and degradation, about reducing human beings to objects to be used and discarded. Children were not spared from these horrors. While less common than adult sacrifices, child sacrifice occurred in many of these cultures. The tomb of Queen Puabi included several children under 10 years old. Chinese oracle bones record the sacrifice of young ones alongside adult servants. Egyptian tombs contain the remains of children included to accompany royal offspring in the afterlife for royal offspring who died young. These children were often too young to understand what was happening to them, killed for reasons they couldn't comprehend in service to gods they barely knew. The economic dimension of burial sacrifice is rarely discussed but crucial to understanding its persistence. These practices created entire industries. Embalmers, tomb builders, ritual specialists, guards, administrators all depended on royal funerals for their livelihoods. The more elaborate the funeral, the more sacrifices required, the more work for everyone involved. There was economic incentive to maintain and even expand these murderous traditions. Merchants specialized in providing goods for sacrificial victims. Clothing, jewelry, cosmetics, musical instruments, all manufactured specifically for people who would be killed. Workshops produced ceremonial strangling cords, ritual daggers, poison vessels. There were guidelines and standards for these implements of murder, craftsmen who took pride in creating the perfect tool for killing young women. The banality of this evil, the way murder became just another trade, shows how completely these societies had normalized atrocity. The role of religious authorities in perpetuating these practices cannot be ignored. Priests and priestesses didn't just condone burial sacrifice. They designed the rituals, selected the victims, supervised the killings. They created elaborate theological justifications for murder, wrote sacred texts explaining why some humans existed only to be killed for others. They transformed the screams of dying women into holy music, the smell of death into sacred incense. These religious leaders often became wealthy from burial sacrifices. They received payment for conducting the rituals, took possession of victims' belongings, controlled the valuable lands around royal tombs. They had every incentive to continue the practice and no incentive to question it. When occasional reformers suggested ending human sacrifice, it was often religious authorities who resisted most strongly, defending murder as sacred tradition. The genetic and demographic impact of these practices was significant. Thousands of young women killed at their reproductive peak, removed from the gene pool to serve dead men. Entire communities could be depleted of young women after a major royal funeral. The Kingdom of Ur probably killed over 2,000 women over several centuries of royal burials. The Shang dynasty may have sacrificed over 13,000 people, mostly women, during its 500-year rule. This systematic killing of young women created demographic imbalances that persisted for generations. Villages that lost their daughters to royal sacrifice struggled to recover populations. Genetic diversity was reduced as the healthiest and most beautiful women were selected for death rather than reproduction. The long-term biological impact of these practices has never been fully calculated, but it must have been substantial. As we near the end of these horrific accounts, we must confront the most disturbing parallel of all. These practices haven't entirely ended. They've simply evolved, become hidden, transformed into different but equally deadly forms. Young women are still sacrificed for the pleasure of powerful men, though now we call it human trafficking instead of religious ritual. Children still die to serve the desires of those who see them as objects rather than humans. The modern version lacks the religious pageantry, the elaborate justifications, the public spectacle. But the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. The powerful consuming the powerless, the young dying for the old, women's lives valued only for their service to men. The tombs are different, the methods updated, but the evil persists. Today's sacrificial victims die in exploitation instead of tombs, killed by abuse and illness instead of ritual asphyxiation. They're selected through poverty and vulnerability instead of royal decree. They're prepared through grooming and drug addiction instead of palace education. But they're still young women and girls chosen to serve until death, their lives considered disposable, their suffering ignored by societies that benefit from their exploitation. The archaeological evidence of ancient burial sacrifice forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and civilization itself. These weren't aberrations or primitive mistakes. They were systematic practices maintained by sophisticated societies for thousands of years. They were ended not by moral evolution but by practical considerations, changing political structures, economic pressures. The capacity for such evil wasn't eliminated. It simply found new expressions. Standing in those ancient tombs today, you can still feel the weight of what happened there. The careful positioning of skeletons tells stories of final moments. Defensive wounds speak of desperate struggles. Clutched objects reveal what victims valued in their last seconds of life. These archaeological sites aren't just historical curiosities. They're sites of mass killing, mass graves, monuments to systematized murder. The silence of these tombs is deafening. Thousands of voices that were permanently silenced. Stories that were never told. Lives that were cut short for the comfort of corpses. Each skeleton was once a living person with hopes, fears, dreams, and desires. Each had a family that mourned them, friends who missed them, potential that was never realized. They were reduced to grave goods, their humanity erased, their individual worth dismissed. But perhaps by remembering them, by refusing to sanitize their stories, by acknowledging the full horror of what was done to them, we honor them in death as they were never honored in life. These weren't willing servants following beloved masters into eternity. They were victims of killing, killed by societies that valued power over compassion, tradition over humanity, the comfort of the dead over the lives of the living. Their bones bear witness to one of history's greatest crimes, a crime repeated thousands of times across centuries and civilizations, a crime that was never punished, never acknowledged, never properly mourned. They deserve better than to be forgotten in archaeological reports. They deserve to be remembered as individuals whose lives were taken and whose humanity must not be ignored. True civilization is not measured by monuments or empires, but by how it values human life.